12 Nights at Oakhaven Hall Chapter 1. The widow's arrival. Lady Elara Vance arrived at Oakhaven Hall on the second night of Christmas, beneath a sky the color of bruised plums, from which sleet fell with vindictive persistence. It suited her reputation exactly. The carriage rolled up the long gravel drive, its wheels grinding against ice and stone, and Elara leaned back against the black velvet seat with a slow, deliberate breath. She had promised herself quite firmly that she would survive this visit without incident. She would be entertaining, she would be provocative, she would distract, but not engage. Above all, she would not mistake hunger for anything resembling affection. Oakhaven Hall rose ahead of her in dark granite severity, its narrow windows glowing with amber lamplight against the winter dusk. No festive wreaths adorned these doors, no cheerful ribbons softened the harsh stone. The Blackwoods did nothing sentimentally, nor did they do it with warmth. Elara had known this long before she accepted the invitation. She was not, strictly speaking, a guest invited for her own sake. She was a useful distraction, the scandalous widow whose presence kept men from boredom and sparked fire in otherwise stagnant rooms. When Lady Seraphina Blackwood's letter arrived in early December, written in her sharp, angular hand, Elara had read it with clear understanding. "My dear Lady Vance, we shall be gathering a full house for the 12 days, and I require your particular talents. You have always been such excellent company for the gentlemen, and I know you appreciate winter in the country. Excellent company. Particular talents." Neither phrase suggested respect or consequence. Elara accepted readily. A cold country manor was preferable to another hollow London season, and the Blackwoods paid generously for entertainment. Now, as footmen hurried forward and the carriage door was wrenched open, she gathered her black fox muff and descended with calculated grace. Freezing air bit her cheeks. Sleet dampened the hem of her midnight silk traveling cloak, which clung to her figure in a way that would scandalize the virtuous and entrance the hungry. The great doors opened, releasing heat, shadows, and the low rumble of masculine voices within. "Lady Vance," announced the butler with careful neutrality. Lady Seraphina herself emerged from the entrance hall, tall, formidable, her silver-streaked hair dressed severely. She extended one gloved hand without warmth. "Lady Vance, how good of you to brave such weather." "I have braved far worse, Lady Seraphina," Elara replied, her smile sharp. "Weather is the least of winter's dangers." Seraphina's eyes, cold and assessing, swept over her guest with thinly veiled disapproval. Elara wore midnight silk that draped rather than concealed, sapphires at her throat that caught the light like captured stars, and an expression that dared anyone to look away. "You will find the house already lively," Lady Seraphina said, her tone clipped. "Julian has assembled his particular circle. I trust you will keep them occupied." Elara smiled again. She had known Julian Blackwood for years, knew his brutal directness, his dangerous reputation, his ability to dominate a room without raising his voice. He had never been kind to her, nor gentle. Their every interaction had been edged with something dark and demanding. She did not expect this visit to be different. She followed Lady Seraphina into the great hall, where the warmth of many fires failed to chase the cold from the stones. No garlands softened these walls. Instead, bare branches twisted in iron vases, and the portraits of Blackwood ancestors glared down with expressions of unforgiving judgment. "Julian is in the east wing at present," Lady Seraphina continued as they moved toward the drawing room. "He will join us before supper. He has been restless of late." Elara inclined her head. She did not ask why Julian might be restless when the house was already full of guests. She would learn in time, as she always did, through observation rather than inquiry. The drawing room held several guests engaged in cards and whispered conversation. Lord Sterling, a rake of the most practiced variety, looked up immediately, his eyes traveling over Elara with unconcealed appreciation. "Vance," he drawled, rising. "Oakhaven is improved immeasurably." "Sterling," Elara replied, her voice honeyed and mocking. "Still losing at cards, I see." He laughed, delighted. "Only my money, never my charm." Miss Cassandra Thorpe, a woman of sharp ambitions and sharper wit, approached with calculated friendship. "Elara, how delicious that you've come. We are to have a masquerade on 12th night. Such drama." "How appropriate," Elara murmured. "Masks are always so revealing." She took the offered seat near the fire, accepting wine from a footman. It was true she was rarely bored at these gatherings. She enjoyed watching people, how they postured, what they concealed, the desires that flickered beneath polished manners. At Oakhaven especially, there was much to observe, for this was the year everything was meant to be decided. She had heard it whispered in London drawing rooms and confirmed in the knowing glances of other guests. Julian Blackwood, master of Oakhaven Hall, was to announce his engagement before 12th night. The lady in question, Miss Evangeline St. Clair, was expected to arrive within days. Elara thought of this without envy or sentiment. Evangeline St. Clair was beautiful, virtuous, and perfectly suited to a man who wanted a wife to ignore. She herself was neither virtuous nor suitable. She was content to play her role from the margins and leave before the wreckage became visible. And yet, when Julian entered just before supper, his riding coat still damp with sleet and his expression carved from granite, Elara noticed everything. She noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his dark eyes swept the room like a predator assessing prey. She noticed that when he finally saw her seated by the fire with wine in hand, something shifted in his expression, not softening but sharpening, as though he had found what he'd been hunting. "Vance," he said, crossing the room with deliberate purpose. "Oakhaven is made more dangerous by your presence." Elara laughed, low and deliberate. "You flatter yourself, Mr. Blackwood, I am merely a guest." He replied, voice rough, "You have never been merely anything." It was nothing, merely provocation. Yet as they held each other's gaze, his dark and demanding, hers defiant and unreadable, Elara felt, without understanding why, that these nights at Oakhaven Hall would not unfold quite as expected. Outside, the sleet turned to snow, and the darkness deepened. Chapter 2. The billiard room. By the fourth night of Christmas, Oakhaven Hall had settled into its particular rhythm. Mornings were reserved for writing, correspondence, and the careful management of reputations. Afternoons brought drinking, gambling, and the dangerous intermingling of too many people with too little restraint. Evenings, lit by fire and shadow, invited conversations that crossed lines between propriety and ruin. Elara moved through it all with practiced ease. She flirted expertly with Lord Stirling, debated literature with Miss Thorpe, and deflected Lady Seraphina's thinly veiled hostility with honeyed indifference. She rode when the weather permitted, drank when it didn't, and retired to her chambers when company threatened to become tiresome. It was during one such evening, when most of the house had gathered for whist, that Julian Blackwood sought her out. Elara was in the billiard room, a space less formal than the grand hall, its dark paneling absorbing lamplight and its windows overlooking the frozen lake. She had been idly contemplating a shot, not particularly invested in the game, when she heard the door close with deliberate finality. "Vance," Julian said from the threshold. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she leaned over the table, lined up her shot, and sent the ivory ball clicking sharply against its target. Only then did she straighten and face him. "Mr. Blackwood, are you lost?" "No." He stepped further into the room, closing the distance between them with predatory confidence. "I am exactly where I intend to be." She set down her cue with careful slowness. "How ominous should I be concerned? You should be honest." Elara raised one dark brow. "I am always honest. It's everyone else who prefers lies wrapped in silk." His jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, merely studied her with an intensity that would have made lesser women retreat. Elara held her ground, her chin lifted, her expression daring him to look away first. "You observe everything," he said finally. "You see what others miss." "Careful, Mr. Blackwood, that almost sounded like a compliment." "It is a fact." He moved closer until only the billiard table separated them. "You see through pretense, you always have." "What pretense am I seeing through now?" His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "Mine." Admission hung between them, sharp and unexpected. Elara felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous, curiosity. "I don't understand," she said, though she suspected she did. "Yes, you do." His voice dropped, rough as gravel. "You know exactly what is expected of me, the announcement, the virtuous bride, the continuation of the bloodline with a woman I can barely stand to speak to." "Then don't announce it," Elara said simply. "Walk away," he laughed, bitter and sharp. "Walk away, as though it were that simple. As though my entire life were not built on duty and expectation and the weight of ancestors who would burn this house to ash before they'd let me choose freely. Yet here you are," Elara said softly, dangerously. "Asking a scandalous widow for counsel. How very reckless of you." "You're right." He circled the table slowly, closing the distance between them. It is reckless. You are reckless. Everything about you is fire and wreckage, and I should stay far away. Elara agreed, not moving. You should. Yet I cannot. They stood face to face now, close enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension carved into every line of his face. This was a man at war with himself, and she was dangerous enough to tip the balance. What do you want from me, Julian? She used his given name deliberately, testing boundaries. He did not rebuke her. Want you to tell me I'm not mad, he said, voice low and raw. I want you to tell me that choosing fire over ice is not suicide. Elara's breath caught. This was the moment she should retreat, should deflect with mockery and distance. Instead, she stepped closer. Not mad, she whispered. You're trapped, and there's a difference. His hand rose, hesitated, then cupped her jaw with surprising gentleness. If I choose fire, he said, everything burns. Her voice was steady despite the hammering of her heart. But at least you'll feel alive while it does. One suspended moment, they stood on the knife's edge of decision. Then Julian closed the distance and kissed her. It was not gentle. It was demand and desperation, heat and hunger, the collision of two people who had circled each other for years without permission to touch. Elara responded in kind, her hands fisting in his coat, her body arching into his with a fierceness that matched his own. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, the world had shifted irrevocably. This, Julian said, his forehead pressed to hers, is madness. Elara agreed, her smile sharp and unrepentant. But we've always been good at madness. They parted shortly after, returning to separate parts of the house with careful composure. But something had broken open between them, and neither wished it sealed again. Outside, the snow fell harder, and the cold deepened. Chapter 3. The porcelain bride Miss Evangeline St. Clair arrived on the 8th day of Christmas. She came in a flurry of white silk and practiced grace. Her carriage scarcely halted before Lady Seraphina swept forward to embrace her like a long-awaited savior. Evangeline was every inch the virtuous bride. Pale, lovely, soft-voiced, and possessed of that fragile perfection which demanded protection without inspiring passion. Elara observed her with detached assessment. Evangeline was, she thought, genuinely kind. She was also utterly hollow. Julian, however, became a statue. Elara noticed it first during supper, when his conversation stilled despite Evangeline's delicate attempts at engagement. Later, during music, he stood apart, his expression locked behind a mask of polite attention. When Elara caught his eye across the room, he looked away immediately, but not before she saw the desperation there. She told herself this was not her concern. She had warned him. She had told him to choose honestly. What he did with that counsel was his burden, not hers. Yet the pull between them remained, undeniable and dangerous. On the 10th night, during a blizzard that howled against the manor's stone walls, they found themselves alone in the long gallery. The space stretched endlessly, its windows black with storm, its shadows thick enough to hide in. Running out of time, Julian said without preamble. Elara stopped walking. They had not been alone since the billiard room. She had avoided it deliberately, knowing that proximity was its own form of ruin. Julian, she used his name again, and this time it felt like a confession. He turned toward her fully, his expression stripped of every defense. 2 more nights, he said. 2 more nights, and I announce my engagement to a woman I will never love. Then don't, Elara said, though her heart hammered painfully. You have a choice. His laugh was hollow. What choice is there, duty or desire, stability or scandal? A respectable death or a ruinous life. You speak as though those are equal costs. Elara stepped closer, drawn despite herself. They are not. Evangeline, he asked, anguish cracking through his voice. She deserves better than a man who flinches every time she speaks. She does, Elara agreed softly, but marrying her anyway would be the greater cruelty. You, his voice dropped to a whisper. What do you deserve? The question struck her like a physical blow. Elara had spent years armoring herself against such vulnerabilities, training herself to expect nothing, to want nothing that could be taken away. Don't, she said, retreating a step. Don't ask me that. Not, because I am not the woman you choose. The words tore out of her, raw and unguarded. I am the scandalous distraction you bed in secret and abandon in daylight. I am the fire that burns too hot to hold. I am not. Everything I want, Julian finished, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. You are everything I want, and I am too much of a coward to claim it. Elara's breath shattered. Then what are we doing, Julian? What is this? I desire the wreckage I feel when I speak with you, he said, his voice breaking. I desire the fire and the ruin and the savage truth of it. I desire you, Elara, and I have no idea how to survive wanting something this much. She closed her eyes, struggling for equilibrium. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away to protect herself from the inevitable collapse. But when she opened her eyes again, he was still there, still looking at her as though she were the only real thing in a house full of ghosts. Then choose, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. Choose the fire or choose the ice, but don't ask me to be your comfort while you marry another woman. I won't be that for you. I won't be that for anyone. His hands rose to frame her face, rough and reverent. If I choose you, everything burns, she finished. I know, but at least it will be honest. They stood in the shadows of the long gallery, the blizzard raging beyond the glass, and made no promises. But the decision had already been made, whether they acknowledged it or not. Outside, the storm raged on, and time continued its merciless count toward Twelfth Night. Chapter 4. The masquerade 12th night arrived with clear, cold skies and a silence that felt like held breath. Oakhaven Hall was transformed, every surface draped in black velvet and silver, candles blazing in iron candelabras, masks laid out like offerings to ancient gods. The masquerade ball was Lady Seraphina's final flourish, a theatrical stage upon which her son would announce his engagement and secure the Blackwood legacy. Guests arrived in jeweled masks and elaborate costumes, their identities obscured but their purposes transparent. Elara wore midnight silk that pooled like liquid shadow, and a mask of black lace and sapphires that concealed nothing of importance. She stood near the edge of the ballroom, champagne in hand, heart strangely calm. She had resolved herself to whatever might come. If Julian chose duty, she would leave before dawn and never return to Oakhaven. If he chose ruin, she would stand beside him and weather the scandal with the same defiance that had carried her through widowhood. Either way, she would survive. She always had. Julian stood near the dais with his mother and Evangeline, all three masked but unmistakable. Lady Seraphina's silver mask glinted like a blade. Evangeline's was delicate white lace, innocence performed with precision. Julian's was simple black leather, and even behind it, Elara could see the tension in his jaw. When the clock began its approach to midnight, the room quieted. Lady Seraphina stepped forward, her voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced authority. My friends, we are gathered tonight to celebrate the close of Christmas and the beginning of a new year. It is also my great pleasure to announce. No, the single word cut through the room like a blade. Julian stepped forward, removing his mask with deliberate slowness. The silence that followed was absolute. Mother, Julian said, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. I cannot make the announcement you expect. Lady Seraphina's expression remained perfectly controlled, but her knuckles whitened around her champagne glass. Julian, this is not the time. It is precisely the time. He turned to face the assembled guests, his expression open and unguarded in a way Elara had never seen. I have the deepest respect for Miss St. Clair. She is virtuous, kind, and everything a man of my position should want in a wife. Evangeline stood frozen, her mask still in place, but even from across the room, Elara could see her trembling. But I cannot offer her a future built on dishonesty, Julian continued. I cannot marry her knowing that every day would be a lie, that I would resent her for my own cowardice, that she deserves a man who loves her wholly rather than one who merely respects her. The murmurs began shocked, scandalized, delighted depending on the audience. Julian's gaze swept the room and found Elara. He held her eyes for one suspended moment, then began walking toward her. The crowd parted like water, every eye tracking his path. I have spent years being what was expected of me, he said, his voice carrying. I have been the dutiful son, the responsible heir, the man who honored tradition above all else, and I have been miserable. He stopped directly in front of Elara, close enough that she could see the fierce resolve in his dark eyes. Vance, he said, his voice rough but clear. You are everything I was taught not to want. You are scandalous, dangerous, and utterly unfit for polite society. You challenge me, infuriate me, and refuse to let me hide behind manners and duty. Elara's vision blurred, but she held his gaze. Julian, and you are the only person who has ever made me feel alive, he finished. The only person who sees the man beneath the title and demands I be honest about it. I don't know what the future holds if I choose you. I know it will be difficult. I know we will face scandal and judgment and every form of social ruin. He took her hands in his, and the room seemed to fall away. But I would rather burn with you, he said quietly, fiercely, than freeze alone in a marriage that means nothing. Tears slipped down Elara's cheeks, but her smile was pure defiance. You're a fool, she whispered. Yes, he agreed, but I'm your fool if you'll have me. Don't do respectable, she warned. I don't do polite or proper or any of the things your family expects. Good, Julian said and kissed her. The ballroom erupted gasps, exclamations, the rustle of fans, and the murmur of ruined reputations. Lady Seraphina stood frozen on the dais, her expression inscrutable. Evangeline, to her credit, removed her mask with quiet dignity and slipped from the room without theatrics. When Julian and Elara finally broke apart, breathless and unrepentant, the crowd had begun to fracture. Some guests were already calling for their carriages, scandalized beyond recovery. Others, Lord Sterling among them, were laughing with delighted admiration. Lady Seraphina descended from the dais and approached with measured steps. For a long moment, she studied Elara with those cold, assessing eyes. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It was not warm, but it was real. You will destroy this family's reputation, she said calmly. Yes, Elara agreed, unapologetic. And you will make my son's life significantly more difficult. Almost certainly, Lady Seraphina nodded slowly. Good, perhaps this family has been too concerned with reputation and not enough with living. She turned to Julian. If you're going to ruin us, at least do it spectacularly. And with that, she walked away, leaving them standing in the wreckage of expectations. As midnight struck and the new year began, Julian and Elara stepped out onto the frozen terrace. Snow crunched beneath their feet and their breath clouded in the frigid air. No going back now, Elara said, her voice steady despite everything. No, Julian agreed, pulling her close. Only forward. They stood together beneath the winter stars, two people who had chosen fire over ice, honesty over ease, and each other over everything else. The nights at Oakhaven Hall had changed them both irrevocably. And neither of them wished it undone.